Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Summer, 1985. Los Angeles was burning under a relentless heat wave, but the city's terror had nothing to do with the temperature. Families bolted their windows despite the suffocating heat. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts within hours. Parents sat awake all night, clutching baseball bats and kitchen knives, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Southern California had become a hunting ground, and no one knew who would be next. The call came through at 3:47 a.m. on June 28. Mission Viejo Police Dispatch received frantic screaming through the line before it went dead. When officers arrived at the modest two-story home on Via Zaragoza, they found the front door ajar, swaying gently in the hot wind. Inside, they discovered a scene that would haunt them forever. 61-year-old Patty Elaine Higgins lay in a pool of blood, her throat slashed so deeply the weapon had scraped bone. Her husband lay unconscious nearby, his skull fractured from repeated blows with a blunt object. But this wasn't the first. Not even close. Detective Gil Carrillo stood in that blood-soaked bedroom, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. For months, he had been tracking a phantom. A killer who struck randomly, viciously, without pattern or mercy. Someone who slipped through neighborhoods like smoke, leaving broken bodies and shattered families in his wake. The attacks varied wildly. Some victims were shot. Others stabbed or bludgeoned. Some were elderly couples. Others were young families with children sleeping down the hall. The only consistency was the savage brutality and the complete absence of a logical motive. "He's not hunting for money," Carrillo said quietly to his partner, Frank Salerno, a legendary homicide detective who had helped catch the Hillside Strangler years before. "He's hunting for pleasure." The evidence they were collecting painted a picture of something truly terrifying. A predator who entered homes through unlocked windows and doors, who moved through the darkness with an almost supernatural silence. Survivors described a tall, thin man with wild dark hair and breath so foul it made them gag. They spoke of his eyes, black and empty, reflecting no humanity whatsoever. Some reported he forced them to swear allegiance to Satan before he killed their loved ones. The media had begun connecting the dots. What police initially thought were isolated incidents now formed a horrifying timeline. March 17, a young woman named Dale Okazaki gunned down in her own garage in Rosemead. Same night, 30-year-old Sailien Yu dragged from her car and shot repeatedly in Monterey Park. March 27, 64-year-old Vincent Zazera and his 44-year-old wife Maxine butchered in their Whittier home. Maxine's eyes had been gouged out, her body mutilated in ways that suggested the killer had spent time with her corpse. By June, the list had grown to include attacks in Burbank, Arcadia, Monrovia, and Glendale. The killer crossed city boundaries as easily as he crossed the threshold into people's homes. No jurisdiction was safe. No neighborhood was protected. He struck in wealthy areas and poor neighborhoods alike. The randomness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. There was no way to predict where he would appear next, no way to prepare, no pattern to exploit. Carrillo studied the crime scene photographs spread across his desk like a macabre deck of cards. He noticed something the others had missed. Small details that connected the scenes. At several locations, the killer had spray-painted pentagrams on walls. Survivors reported he spoke about the Night Stalker, referring to himself in the third person, as if the killer was something separate from the man, a demon he had invited inside. Salerno lit another cigarette, his 20th that day. "We're not dealing with a human being anymore, Gil. We're dealing with pure evil." The investigation was unlike anything the LAPD had ever seen. Multiple crime scenes across multiple cities, all potentially connected. The press was in a frenzy. Headlines screamed about the Night Stalker, a name that only seemed to feed the killer's ego. Each new attack felt like a taunt, a challenge to the dozens of detectives working around the clock to stop him. Then, on August 17, the killer made his first mistake. He left a footprint. Not just any footprint, but a distinct impression from an Avia aerobic sneaker, a relatively rare brand. Crime scene technicians were able to determine the exact size. It wasn't much, but it was something tangible, something real they could chase. 3 days later, another attack. Bill Carnes, 29, shot 3 times in the head while he slept. His fiancée, Inez Erickson, raped and forced to swear her love to Satan. But Inez was observant. Despite her terror, she memorized details. The orange Toyota station wagon the attacker drove. Part of the license plate. And when police ran those partial plates, they got a hit. The vehicle belonged to a woman in Los Angeles. But when they found the car abandoned in a Rampart District parking lot, they discovered something that would crack the case wide open. Inside, they lifted a perfect fingerprint from the rearview mirror. After running it through the new automated system, they finally had a name. Richard Ramirez. 25 years old. A drifter from El Paso, Texas, with a criminal record for drug possession and traffic violations. They had his face. They had his name. Now they just had to find him before he killed again. But when Detective Carrillo looked at Ramirez's booking photo, those dead black eyes staring back at him, he felt a chill run down his spine despite the August heat. The man in that photograph was still out there, somewhere in the sprawling maze of Los Angeles, and he had no idea the net was closing around him. What happened next would turn the hunter into the hunted, and an entire city into an army of vigilantes desperate for justice. August 30, 1985. The decision was made in a cramped conference room at LAPSD headquarters, with 24 exhausted detectives arguing over the biggest gamble of their careers. Detective Gil Carrillo stood at the front, holding up the mugshot of Richard Ramirez like a wanted poster from the Old West. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to propose. "We release his face to every newspaper, every television station in Southern California," Carrillo said, his voice cutting through the cigarette smoke that hung in the air like fog. "We turn 4 million people into our eyes and ears." The room erupted. Some detectives argued it would spook Ramirez, send him running to Mexico or deep into hiding. Others worried about vigilante justice, about innocent men who resembled the suspect getting hurt. But Frank Salerno, the veteran who had seen more evil than most men could stomach, slowly nodded his agreement. "He doesn't know we have him," Salerno said quietly. "He's been invisible for months. He thinks he's untouchable. We use that arrogance against him." The next morning, Richard Ramirez's face was everywhere. Front page of the Los Angeles Times. Leading story on every local news broadcast. His booking photo stared out from newspaper stands on every corner, from television screens in shop windows, from flyers taped to telephone poles and subway stations. The headline read simply, "Night Stalker, have you seen this man?" But Ramirez didn't know. While the city woke up to his face plastered across every surface, he was in Arizona, visiting his brother. He had been there for days, completely disconnected from the media firestorm erupting back in California. He had no television, no radio, no newspapers. He was planning his return to Los Angeles, already thinking about his next victim, already feeling that familiar hunger rising inside him. On August 31, Ramirez stepped off a Greyhound bus at the downtown Los Angeles terminal, completely unaware he had just walked into a city that knew exactly who he was. He wore a black AC/DC t-shirt and filthy jeans, his long hair greasy and unkempt. He needed money, needed to score some cocaine, needed to disappear into the anonymous sprawl of the city like he had done dozens of times before. He walked casually down the street toward a liquor store, hands in his pockets, that familiar predatory smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The heat was oppressive, the morning sun already brutal. Inside the store, he grabbed a Pepsi from the cooler and approached the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged Korean woman, looked up from her newspaper. Her eyes moved from the paper to Ramirez's face. Back to the paper. Back to his face. The color drained from her cheeks. Her hand moved slowly toward the phone beneath the counter. Ramirez noticed the change immediately. Something was wrong. The way she looked at him, the fear in her eyes, it was different from the usual suspicion he encountered. This was recognition. He left the store without paying, walking faster now, his instincts screaming danger. At the corner, he saw a newspaper vending machine. Through the glass, he could see his own face staring back at him. His stomach dropped. His mouth went dry. He was famous, but not in the way he had fantasized. He wasn't feared anymore. He was hunted. Ramirez broke into a run. He needed to get out of downtown, needed to find somewhere to hide, to think. He ran east, toward East Los Angeles, a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood where he thought he might blend in, where maybe people wouldn't recognize him. But as he ran, he noticed people staring. A woman crossing the street clutched her purse tighter and hurried away. A group of men working on a car stopped and watched him pass, their expressions hardening. In the Boyle Heights neighborhood, Ramirez tried to carjack a 1966 Mustang. He yanked open the door while the owner, Faustino Pinion, sat behind the wheel. "Get out!" Ramirez screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. But Pinion was not an easy mark. The 56-year-old father fought back, punching Ramirez in the face before the killer could pull him from the vehicle. Ramirez staggered back and ran. He tried again on Hubbard Street. This time, he attempted to pull Angelina de la Torre from her Ford Granada. But de la Torre's husband, Manuel, heard her screams and came running from their house. Behind him, their neighbors emerged from homes and shops. Within seconds, Ramirez was surrounded by a dozen angry people, all of them recognizing the face from the morning news. "ESL Matador," someone shouted. "The killer. ESL Night Stalker." Ramirez ran faster than he had ever run in his life. Behind him, the crowd grew. 20 people. 30. 50. Men grabbed baseball bats and metal pipes. Women screamed for their husbands to catch him. Children watched from porches as the monster who had terrorized their city fled through their streets like a wounded animal. On Town Avenue, Ramirez tried to scale a fence into a backyard. Manuel de la Torre caught up to him and grabbed his leg, yanking him back down. Ramirez kicked him in the face and scrambled over, tearing his shirt on the chain link. In the backyard, he tried another car. The keys were in the ignition. But before he could start the engine, the homeowner, 32-year-old Jose Burgoyne, smashed through the back door wielding a length of rebar. "Get out of my car!" Burgoyne roared in Spanish. Behind him, the mob was climbing the fence, pouring into the yard like a flood. Ramirez abandoned the vehicle and kept running. His lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. Blood streamed from cuts on his arms and face. The crowd behind him had swelled to nearly 100 people now, a roaring wave of rage and justice. They were going to kill him. He could hear it in their voices, could feel their fury like heat on his back. On Hubbard Street, he saw another car and made one final, desperate attempt. But the owner, Jamie Burgoyne, Jose's brother, hit him across the back with a metal fence post. Ramirez collapsed to his knees. The crowd surrounded him, closing in from all sides. Fists and feet and weapons rained down on him. He curled into a ball, feeling ribs crack, tasting blood, hearing the screaming in Spanish and English blend into one continuous roar of retribution. "Someone call the police," a woman's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't let him die. He needs to face justice." Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. 2 LAPD patrol cars screeched to a halt, and officers had to physically push through the mob to reach Ramirez. He was barely conscious, his face swollen and bloody, his clothes torn to shreds. As officers handcuffed him and pulled him to his feet, the crowd pressed close, spitting on him, cursing him in 2 languages, promising him hell. Deputy Sheriff Jim Ellis grabbed Ramirez by the back of the neck and shoved him into the patrol car. Through the window, Ramirez could see their faces. Not fear anymore. Not terror. Just pure, burning hatred. The city had turned against him completely. He was no longer a ghost, no longer untouchable. He was just a man, broken and beaten, caught by the very people he had terrorized. As the patrol car pulled away, escorted by a convoy of police vehicles, Detective Gil Carrillo received the call he had been waiting for. They had him. The Night Stalker was in custody. But as Carrillo hung up the phone and allowed himself a moment of relief, he knew the real challenge was just beginning. They had to build an airtight case. They had to connect Ramirez to every crime, every victim, every drop of blood. They had to make sure he never walked free again. But in a cell 20 miles away, Richard Ramirez sat smiling through broken teeth, and when investigators asked him if he had anything to say, his response sent chills through everyone in the room. September 1985. The Los Angeles County Men's Central Jail became the most heavily guarded facility in California. Richard Ramirez sat in an isolation cell under 24-hour surveillance, but the man police dragged bleeding from the streets seemed to have vanished. In his place sat something else entirely. Something that smiled constantly, that seemed to feed on the attention, that transformed his capture into a twisted form of celebrity. Detective Gil Carrillo sat across from Ramirez in the interrogation room for the first time, a single table between them. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Ramirez's battered face. His eyes, those dead black eyes that survivors described, locked onto Carrillo's without blinking. Then Ramirez leaned forward and whispered 6 words that made Carrillo's blood run cold. "You don't even know them all." The investigation that followed was the largest manhunt conclusion in California history, becoming the most complex prosecution the state had ever attempted. Carrillo and Salerno worked 18-hour days, building a timeline of terror that stretched across 14 months and 5 counties. They connected Ramirez to 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. But they suspected there were more, many more, that they would never be able to prove. The evidence was overwhelming. The obvious sneaker print matched shoes found in Ramirez's possession. His fingerprints were lifted from multiple crime scenes. Survivors identified him in lineup after lineup, many of them breaking down in tears as they pointed to the man who had shattered their lives. Ballistics matched bullets recovered from victims to a single .22 caliber handgun that Ramirez had stolen and used repeatedly. But Ramirez seemed to relish every moment. When investigators showed him crime scene photographs, hoping to break him down, to extract a confession, He studied them with the detached interest of an artist reviewing his work. He made no denials. He offered no remorse. He simply smiled that awful smile and said nothing. The trial began on July 22, 1988, nearly 3 years after his capture. The Los Angeles Superior Court had never seen anything like it. The courtroom was packed daily with victims' families, true crime enthusiasts, and most disturbingly, women who had become obsessed with Ramirez. They sat in the gallery wearing black, blowing him kisses, holding signs professing their love. He smiled back at them, drawing pentagrams in the air with his finger. Ramirez had transformed himself into a showman of evil. He grew his hair longer, cultivated a dark mystique. On his palm, he had carved a pentagram that he displayed proudly to cameras. He showed up to court wearing sunglasses, sneering at photographers, shouting, "Hail Satan," to reporters. He was no longer Richard Ramirez, petty criminal from El Paso. He had become the Night Stalker, a legend in his own twisted mind. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Philip Halpin, methodically presented their case. Survivor after survivor took the stand, reliving the worst nights of their lives. Inez Erickson, whose fiancé Bill Carnes had been shot 3 times in the head, testified about the sexual assault, about being forced to swear her love to Satan while the man she loved lay dying in the next room. Carnes had survived but suffered permanent brain damage, his brilliant engineering career destroyed. Somkid Kovananth described how Ramirez shot her husband Chainarong in the head while he slept, then raped her while her children slept down the hall. She identified the pentagram he drew on her thigh, the way he forced her to tell him where they kept their valuables, how he seemed to take pleasure in her fear. 8-year-old James Romero III, the boy who had seen Ramirez's orange Toyota station wagon the night of the Carnes attack, testified about writing down the partial license plate. His memory had been the thread that unraveled everything. The jury listened in silence as this brave child, now 11, described his decision to grab a pen and paper instead of going back to bed. The defense, led by public defenders Daniel and Arturo Hernandez, faced an impossible task. The evidence was crushing. Their strategy became one of mitigation rather than innocence. They painted a picture of Ramirez's horrific childhood in El Paso, the abuse he suffered, the head injuries from his father's beatings, his Vietnam veteran cousin's influence who showed young Richard photographs of torture and murder from the war. They suggested he was insane, that the drugs and Satanism had destroyed his ability to distinguish right from wrong. But the prosecution's rebuttal was simple and devastating. Ramirez knew exactly what he was doing. He planned his attacks. He chose victims carefully. He took precautions to avoid capture. He stole their valuables to support his drug habit. This was not insanity. This was pure evil making rational choices. The trial lasted over a year, the longest criminal trial in California history at that time. On September 20, 1989, after 22 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with verdicts on all 43 counts. The courtroom fell silent as the forewoman stood. Guilty. 13 counts of murder. Guilty. 5 counts of attempted murder. Guilty. 11 counts of sexual assault. Guilty on every single charge. Ramirez showed no emotion. He simply stared ahead, that smile never leaving his face. During the penalty phase, when the jury would decide between life in prison or death, the prosecution presented even more evidence of his depravity. The mutilation of Maxine Zazera's body. The gouging of her eyes. The children who witnessed their parents' murders. The elderly couples beaten to death in their own beds. On November 7, 1989, the jury recommended death. Judge Michael Tynan formally sentenced Ramirez to die in California's gas chamber. As he was led from the courtroom, Ramirez turned to the cameras and spoke his final public words, words that would haunt California for decades. Big deal. Death always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland. Richard Ramirez was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he would spend the next 23 years filing appeals, giving interviews, and receiving love letters from disturbed women around the world. He married one of them in 1996, a magazine editor named Doreen Leoie who insisted he was innocent despite overwhelming evidence. Detective Gil Carrillo continued working homicides for the LAPD, but he never forgot the Night Stalker case. In interviews years later, he would say that Ramirez was the only killer he ever encountered who seemed to have no humanity left inside him whatsoever. When you looked in his eyes, Carrillo said, there was nothing there. No soul. No conscience. Just emptiness. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died in Marin General Hospital from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. He was 63 years old. He had been on death row for 23 years but never faced execution. California's endless appeals process had kept him alive long enough for cancer to finish what the state could not. Some of his victims' families felt cheated that he died peacefully in a hospital bed rather than facing the punishment the jury had prescribed. Others felt relief that he was finally gone, that the monster was dead and could never hurt anyone again. But for the survivors, for the families who lost mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sons and daughters, his death brought no real closure. The scars he left, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal. The Night Stalker case changed how law enforcement operated in Los Angeles. It led to better coordination between different police departments, improved fingerprint databases, and new protocols for handling serial crime investigations. The case proved that even the most elusive predator could be caught when an entire community united against evil. But it also revealed something darker about human nature. The women who fell in love with Ramirez, the people who celebrated him as some kind of dark icon, the way his image was plastered on t-shirts and tattoos by those who glorified his crimes. It showed that monsters can become celebrities, that evil can be romanticized, that some people will always be drawn to darkness no matter how many lives it destroys. Today, the survivors continue to live with what Richard Ramirez did to them. Some have rebuilt their lives and found peace. Others still wake up in the middle of the night, checking locks, listening for sounds that don't belong. The scars on their bodies have faded, but the scars in their minds remain fresh, a permanent reminder of the summer when a demon walked through Southern California and taught an entire city the true meaning of terror. The Night Stalker is dead. But the night he brought to so many families, the darkness he spread through countless homes, that nightmare lingers still. And sometimes, on hot summer nights in Los Angeles, when the Santa Ana winds blow and the city feels like it's burning, people still lock their windows despite the heat, still check their doors twice before bed, still remember the summer of 1985 when evil had a face and that face smiled as it destroyed everything it touched. The monster is gone. But the shadows he cast remain, a permanent scar on the soul of California, a reminder that true evil doesn't just exist in movies and nightmares. Sometimes it walks among us, wearing a human face, waiting for darkness to fall.